What's going on, everybody? You're watching Piercing the Veil Through the Hall of Mirrors, and I'm your host, Rooster McNuggets. So I got a download recently as I was pondering the mysteries of the universe, and I was wondering, how is it that the infinite is composed in the finite? And so we have different religions and cultures, viewpoints to kind of summarize this, but how does that even happen? And as I was pondering these different mysteries, it seemed like there was a parallel in trying to understand the infinite in the finite. And I all of a sudden this word, a cipher, came to mind. And so I looked up what a cipher is, and it's basically a procedure, steps of doing something so that it creates an algorithm so that you have layers. And so you can actually get programming from code. And so you start with something very simple, zeros and ones as it were, but you build off of these premises through these patterns. And that's what life is. It's this patterning on top of patterning on top of patterning. Well, what is that? That's like a filter is what I thought of as a cipher. It's like if you have all, and yet here we are in the temporal, how is the finite in the infinite? And so it's a motion, but there can't be motion in something that is the all, right? Because it's static. It is like what it always has been. And so, well, you could do like an hourglass. You can kind of like create the illusion that it's moving from one to the other. And so what you have is a spectrum. And what came to my mind was, well, zeros and ones is what I'm thinking of. And so what is a world? You know, you look at a world and it's like a circle, it's a sphere, right? But what if that's simultaneously a black hole? And so it depends on how you're seeing it, but it's spinning as a zero and a one. It's one as a monad, as an earth, as a world, but it's not representing the infinite. So it's only a partial look at things. So that's what a word or a world or an algorithm is. And so in that sense, it creates a zero because it's just a funnel, it's a vacuum. And so what seems like a projected world to us is actually simultaneously a zero being ciphered, and so filtered, in other words. And so like that's why I thought of cipher. And then when you look at the definition of how these are steps and codes, then that makes a lot of sense. You know, it starts to create this spectrum from 0 to 1, as it were. And that would be your world, but it would be a finite perspective. There's all kinds of potential you could choose from, but you create an algorithm by starting here and then building off of that. Now, why it's a filter is because it's not the complete. So you have the complete filtering through this algorithm, and there's your projected world. That's just like DNA, you know. We have the programmings for the life in it itself, but it has to, it's like a film projector. You know, why we say projection is because you're using light to create the illusion of motion on the screen, right? So anyways, that's true with all of these different religions. They're all worldviews, they're all filters. And so, yeah, I saw this 0 and 1, and that kind of summarized quantum physics for how I understand it. And that would be like, you know, a cipher. Yeah, and so what I saw, okay, so that would be like, well, you could see the world and swirling all these different motions, but if you were going to try to like crystallize that in your mind so it understood as a functionality, then you could see it as like like a sphere with holes poked in it, and only certain things can fall through those holes, like a strainer. And then of course there's another strainer underneath that, and another strainer underneath that, and that's why Ezekiel was talking about wheels within wheels. And this is like how karma works, is because all of these worlds are based on a spectrum of principles that relate to another. And so it seems like a great swirling mass, like what we're looking at right now, but there is order to it, and that order is based on how we see our projection and how it aligns with that mirror, because reality is, but we're only seeing it from a finite perspective. So we're the ones that are wrong, as it were, in the sense that there are always greater patterns of trying to see this when we're moving from a subjective perspective to a total perspective. You know, there are degrees, and so that is what represents the world, and so it's swirling, and we're supposed to overcome the world. Jesus has overcome the world, and so world, but was the word, because the word is an algorithm. It is a partial, it's knowledge in itself. So knowledge would be perfect from the mind of God unless it's separated from, you know, in the sense that it's combined with, it's mixed with ignorance. In this, it means it gets arrogant in thinking that it is the totality of that perspective is the totality of reality. You know, that's the arrogance of thinking one is God in the fall, and this whole story of why we can't see straight anymore. And so this is my way of trying to make sense of that. How is it that here we are living in the infinite and cannot see our eternal potential, because we've told ourselves funky stories, and we don't see that we're not willing to look at how they conflict, even though fundamentally they point towards a truth. And so if we want to merge with that and be married closer to that, then we have to start to unravel these conflicts within ourselves, because that's the premise that we've started with. That's why we're born, as it were, to work these things out. And so and if we don't, then we end up stuck in a hell, and that's when we start pointing our fingers and saying that God is wrong. But that's because we haven't come to the end of ourselves. And so there's this death and rebirth process that's continually going on throughout the day. This is why true humility is hard to come by, because it's something that's learned after you get your ass handed to you over time. You know, you can see knowledge and see how it's beneficial and want to move towards that, but as we move towards that in an arrogance and a prideful way, so that we could use it towards our advantage, which is where we all start off at, we realize that that's not correct either. And so it's kind of this luring into power so that we can use it in a way that's beneficial for others, as we dive to how we used it incorrectly, you know. And so that's the hell that we build for ourselves. And so you could see it's a learning process, and if we realize that life is eternal, then we don't get so hyperbole and caught up in the tragedies of life, you know, because it can be tragic, because we've wasted this potential that but it's only wasted if we don't learn the lesson. You know, suffering points towards the fact that we know there could be better. Well, if we know that there could be better, that means that we should practice as much. There's an option there. You know, that shows our potentiality. Otherwise, we'd be stuck in our mire. You know, so praise God that we could see these things. And it's scary to not know what that means, you know, and so that's the humility that we're developing. What does that mean? You know, And so this is that relationship that we're developing, and that is the Christ that is being brought forth, is coming in the cloud, and the witnesses of his people, her people, the bride being the female. So we would be the receptive factor, Christ being the male factor. And so there's a wedding, and all that's constantly talking about this infinite and the finite, the reaping, the separation, the wedding, the supper. These are all pointing towards these processes that we're currently engaged in, and how we can move closer or further away from source. And it's easy to fool oneself. The basis of this is fear and faith, moving towards sincerity. As fear pops up because we're scared of certain things, then this is a dummy light for us to look at it, so that we can figure out what it is that has us scared, so that we can then put our faith in the resources that God has provided in order to overcome that insecurity. And that's why we're given powers to overcome. But we have to look at it. This is what we're tasked with as the witness of consciousness, is because we're finite, we can only look at so much at any given time. So the question is, what are we going to look at? What is the Most High? Well, only the individual like yourself can make that up for themselves. They have to assess, what is the Most High for myself? Well, everybody in the world today is trying to tell you what that should be. And there is a temptation and stories in itself. But we have to find what that is for ourselves in order to be reborn again. We have to die to the world. And then we have to look towards the Christ within us, so that one can be resurrected and be sown back into the vine, And then there's this falling away again, because we get caught up in these shiny little objects. But this is the layers that are dropping off, the dross that's being removed from us as we move from 0 to 1, And it's this constant moving, What we think of eternity, we think that's scary because we're caught up in the casings. And we can't imagine an eternity stuck in something like this. How boring and dreadful. But that's a failure of imagination. We don't understand God's glory. We do not realize what we have been tasked with, and the glory that, what it says, the secrets of God are the glories of kings to search out, And so this is a beautiful destiny that you've been inherited with. And there are certain people that would like you to not realize your potential, not understand your divine inheritance. And I'm here to encourage and remind you that you are an infinite being, and it's time for us to stand up again. I love y'all.